Hello everyone. Let's adjust. That's too bright. Okay. Yep. Okay, and we're back. Yes, so YouTube has shut me down. And since they've striked me now 3 times already, I have no reason to believe that they will not strike me a 4th time, and a 5th time, etc. So, we're doing the live stream here tonight, and it will be uploaded to YouTube in due time. Speaking of which, I better make... Alright. Yeah, so... Hello, Albert. Yeah, I'll just wait a second for people to join. Yes, that's right, Marty. There is something wrong with YouTube, especially tonight. Penny, the strikes don't count towards getting rid of your channel because they are robotic strikes, not human strikes. So I'm not worried about that. Yeah. Hang on a second, I'm gonna have to pause this for a sec. Stop. Alright, we're back. Sorry, just had to make sure that the recording was gonna have my voice in it, because I made that mistake last time. Anyway, channel updates. Everyone's been enjoying the New Year's video. Thank you very much for all of the comments. Took me a lot longer than I initially thought it would, but what can you do? But I do have a video almost ready for this Sunday. It will be railway themed and a band. It's railways and urbex combined, so I think you'll all enjoy it. I just need to figure out the rendering issues that have been happening with that. But yeah, that should be out this Sunday. And yeah, I think from now on I should be back to weekly uploads, because now I am actually going back to uni, but I'm only going back part-time, so I should have enough time to edit videos and stuff. They won't be huge, big, complex projects like New Year's, but I'll have a video out every Sunday. So, tonight's topic: short and medium distance rail. This was obviously this is a follow-up to 2 weeks ago's live stream, which was about long distance rail. Now, I had a comment from one of the viewers who sort of said, you should really be splitting it up even further. You should have true metro services, which is sort of, I think they said under half an hour to the city. Then you've got suburban services, an hour. Then you've got sort of semi-regional services, under 2 hours-ish. Then you've got day return trips, and then you've got longer than day return. So yeah, I'm not going to take on board those definitions for this series of live streams, because it's just easier, and I always was going at this from a Victorian Australian sort of perspective. So yeah, but yeah, getting on to the meat of the topic, I'm so specifically talking about it from a Victorian perspective. For those of you who are not Victorian, we have two major operators of our trains. We've got Metro, which mainly run the suburban services, and V-Line, which mainly run the regional services. However, there is a bit of crossover, and so that's what we're really going to be talking about today, is that crossover. Where should the crossover be? Should V-Line get any suburban services? When should it become a suburban service? Does a suburban service have to be electric? Hint, no it doesn't. All that kind of thing. So what I'm defining, just to recap, what I'm defining as short distance rail is anything sort of within Melbourne. Generally it's within an hour-ish of the city. The exact boundaries of that, it's not exactly clear, but you can get a good enough idea by just looking at, like, where do the suburbs end, how socially and economically, how much is this place tied to Melbourne, and how much is it sort of independent, if you like. So, in terms of Melbourne, looking into the V-Line network, I guess I'll first talk about down on the Gippsland Way. Currently, the metro services end in Pakenham. Is that a good place for them to end? I think so. Narnagoon, which is the next station down from Pakenham, it's slowly becoming suburbia, but I'd still classify it as a town of its own rather than a suburban type thing. Yeah, and it's probably not worth extending suburban services to Narnagoon when it does eventually become a suburb, because there's only one stop, and there isn't really that much growth in terms of suburban sprawl growth type thing. That's not really happening. It is, but it isn't at the same time. It's more prevalent in other areas, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. And so, yeah, the V-Line services get a bit more intertwined, I guess, with Metro when you start looking out to the west. In the west, you've got stations such as, well, all the stations west of Sunshine, so Ardeer, Deer Park, Coalbank, Caroline Springs, Cobblebank now, the newest one, Tarneet Wintervale, all those stations which I just mentioned, and Melton counts, Bacchus Marsh, almost, but we'll talk about Bacchus Marsh in a minute. They're all what I would call suburban stations, even though they are exclusively served by V-Line. So what's the point? Like, big deal. Metro or V-Line, as long as they get a service, as long as they get a decent service, does it really matter? Well, yes, in short, because V-Line's job is supposed to be for the regional commuters, right? They should really be in charge of the medium and the long, not the short. Because if you start intertwining the short and the medium, then you start to find out that, hey, the short distance passengers, there's a lot more of them than the longer distance, and so you'll have a train that's meant to go to Ballarat, for example, and 90% of its passengers are east of Bacchus Marsh, we'll say. And so, I don't know the exact figure, but it's a significant portion that is west of Bacchus Marsh. And so what happens is that the Ballarat and Ballan commuters, they sort of get squashed out, and there's just way more of everyone else. And so it also leads to it also sort of conflicts with the idea of train design. I talked in last episode about different sort of accommodation options and whatnot. Similar sorts of things apply in short and medium distance. In short distance, it's going to be higher density seating. The seats aren't going to be as comfortable, but it doesn't matter because your main priority is really just fitting as much people in as possible. And actually, I will talk a bit later in the stream about metro trains and how they're sort of confusing the ultra city commuters to the outer suburban commuters. Thanks, Chop and Chop, for that you like the New Year's Eve vid. So it's, in terms of carriage design, you'll find that the medium distance ones, the seats aren't as comfortable as the long distance trains, but they're not as uncomfortable as the metro trains. They've got, and consequently, you fit less people in because it's the scale, right? On one end of the scale, you've got fit as many people in as possible. On the other end, you've got be as comfortable as possible. Obviously, if you wanted to be as comfortable as possible, you'd have the whole carriage to yourself, basically. But that's obviously not very cost effective. But yeah, the velocities which form the mainstay of V-Line's fleet, they were really built for medium distance. And it's funny because now we're sort of in the process of getting short and long distance versions of the velocity, but the main ones that you see today, they're medium distance. That's what they're really designed for. And I'm sure if you follow the Victorian railway scene, you've seen plenty of pictures of V-Line trains that are just jam-packed to the brim with people. And it really sucks for the medium distance commuters. It really does. Because do you want to stand up for 2 hours? Not really. And theoretically, you shouldn't have to stand up for 2 hours, but even 1 hour, standing up for 1 hour, it's doable, but it's not the most pleasant experience. You sort of expect that most people would clear within the half-hour margin, but the problem is that anything within V-Line sort of doesn't serve 0 minutes to half hours. They only really serve half hour. Yeah, I'll say half hour and beyond, because it takes about a half hour to get to Sunshine. So yeah, they just the trains fill up unnecessarily, and not only is it uncomfortable for the commuters, but it means that V-Line has to sort of cater to two very different needs, and so it just, yeah, they're just not really the most compatible. So, reading some comments. Emotional Support Cat says, as it stands, it's more cost effective to run electric trains on the shorter runs. With the growth of renewable energy in the form of solar farms and wind farms, the PT system swaying towards electric. Yes, I'll talk about electrification a little bit later, because Melbourne's a bit different because we're running on an old electric system. Queensland has got electrification all the way up to Rockhampton, which is an overnight trip, basically. I think so. Or maybe it's not quite overnight, but it's definitely a long way. It's further than anything we've got in Melbourne. Or technically they've got electrification all the way to Emerald, but electric passenger trains as far as Rockhampton. And he's also saying, again, in saying that I take the Ballarat service in the morning, it's so packed you can't find a seat. In that case, we would benefit from more frequent, faster services. Yes, but yeah, absolutely more frequent, faster services. Specifically, more frequent services. But yes, that's a good point, in that if you separate out the short distance from the medium distance, you can speed up your services a little bit, because you're not needing to stop in every single small station. If it's served, so just for anyone who doesn't know, if a station is served by Metro as well as V-Line, V-Line only stop at a select few, and it's generally only for picking up or dropping off, depending on the direction. MarTV, sprinters are best used for short and medium distance travel. Yes, sprinters are interesting because they aren't as set up for medium distance as the velocities, but they aren't as set up for the short distance as metros, so they're sort of an in-between. And I think they actually do a good job on the Stony Point service, which we will talk about a little bit later. The most uncomfortable seats are on the Extrapolis. Yeah, that's partially due to the suspension design more than the actual carriage internal design. Albert says Sydney electrification is under 200 kilometres north and west using 1,500 volts DC technology. Yes, although Sydney's situation is different, I'll say. It's not that I'll save that for the electrification discussion. Emotional support. Oh, well, firstly, MarTV is saying Seymour is medium distance. Absolutely, I agree. Emotional support cat. Again, the problem with electrification is the fact that they're forced to use DC, which needs substation. Yeah, right. So I'll talk about electrification a little bit later. All right. So now that we've got the idea out of the way that short and medium distance should be separated, I guess I'll talk a little bit about, in terms of Melbourne, where that boundary should be. I think for the Geelong line, it's pretty clear Wynnum Vale is suburbia. It is. So, I would like to see suburban services as far as Wynnum Vale, and Geelong services, I would say, stop at Wynnum Vale, stop at Sunshine, Footscray, Southern Cross. I would skip Tarneet on a Geelong-bound service, or further, obviously. I would skip Deer Park and Ardea. Those are all suburban stations. The reason, really, for it to be, the reason that it's Melbourne is developed like this is really due to the fact that Melbourne is growing and the boundaries haven't officially changed. So, in effect, Melbourne has grown, but if you look at the railway definitions of Melbourne, they haven't really grown. And we're very much stuck with the idea that electric is for suburban, diesel is for regional. And I know I keep hinting at this, but I'll get there. The electrification discussion. In terms of the Ballarat line, I think that it should end at Bacchus Marsh. I think Bacchus Marsh is what I would consider suburbia. But it's sort of an iffy case. Melton is definitely in that suburban category, but everyone talks about electrification to Melton, but you'll find that Bacchus Marsh is a pretty big town, so if you electrify to Melton, or you provide dedicated suburban services to Melton, only as far as Melton and not as far as Bacchus Marsh, then you automatically you're encouraging the Bacchus Marsh commuters to drive to Melton and catch the train from there. It's not the best if you have lots of people from a big town driving to a suburban station, because station car parks, they fill up, and you can build the car park as big as you want, it will fill up eventually. And so instead of, provide some car parks, sure, but the majority of your commuters, if they're catching public transport, they should get there by public transport. So in other words, buses play a big role. And buses are notorious in Melbourne for having convoluted routes that are not very good, and the buses are not fast. They used to have the reputation of being really dirty and, you wouldn't want to travel on a bus. That's definitely changed, but the routes and the frequencies of the buses, they need a big revamp. And they should feed into the railway stations. It's a well-known concept, feeder buses. So, suburban services should go as far as Bacchus Marsh. Now, you'll notice that now that only leaves Balan, and then you've got Ballarat and Windaree, technically, which is a suburb of Ballarat. So you might sort of say, well, there's not much point running a service just for 2-3 stations, so what's the point in doing that? Well, I agree, and so that's why I think that Ballarat should get some more suburban stations, and they should add in another station, another regional station in between Balan and Ballarat. The likely place I would put it is Gordon. Now let me just get up Google Maps so that I can refresh my memory. Yeah, so there's not really a big town between Bacchus Marsh and Balan. Gordon isn't necessarily a big town either, but it's big enough, and you'll effectively be pulling in people from the surrounding tiny places, and taking pressure off of Bacchus Marsh. And people will mostly drive to Gordon, but that's okay because it's a regional station, not so much a city station. Once you get into Ballarat, I think that they should provide a station. The former Ballarat East station is probably a bit too close. I would say provide one. I don't think they had any. Let me get up another map. Yeah, they had Warren Heap. There used to be a station at Warren Heap. Again, there's not much point having that one because it's just a bit far out, but call it Eureka, right? Somewhere on sort of the fringes of Ballarat to the east. The Ballarat suburb of Eureka is sort of nearby there, so call it Eureka or maybe Brown Hill, that's another close one. Doesn't really matter. You get my point. Windaree, that can keep its service. That's in a reasonably good spot. I'd even provide a station to the north of Ballarat, sort of like what you see in Bendigo. Yeah, say Invermay Park is the suburb, or you could call it Ballarat North or whatever. But yeah, point is, station in the north of Ballarat and have services alternate between going to Windaree and we'll call it Ballarat North. Now, Ballarat itself does extend quite a bit south, and so I think those areas are then best served by buses going to either Ballarat main station or to Eureka station for the purposes of this discussion. Yeah, and that way I think that the Ballarat stays as a regional service, and you can it helps Ballarat specifically develop into more of an independent city. And it is already, but there's a lot of people that sort of live in the Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong sort of areas that commute to Melbourne because that's where all the jobs are. And, you know, they, for one reason or another, they want to live out in the country. Could be because it's cheaper, could be because they like the country. Doesn't really matter. But if you sort of make Ballarat, Geelong, Bendigo, Seymour, etc., all the sort of medium distance places, if you make them more independent, then you lessen the flow of people coming every day from Ballarat to Melbourne. You limit it to... There will always be some things that you'll need to go to Melbourne for that just aren't available in Ballarat. And there'll be tourists and stuff going either way. But yeah. In the north, there's always talk about electrification to Wallen. I don't see a huge need for it right now. I think that the regional services up that way do pretty alright. And similar thing in the east, where we see, and I've sort of touched on this already, Pakenham, there's always talk about, maybe electrify to Warrigal. Well, yeah, so Warrigal was electrified, and I don't really see the huge need for it. Gippsland is mostly segregated, but in terms of social and economically, not segregated, but separated, we'll say. The thing that really needs to happen with the Gippsland line, and they should have really done this with the level crossing removals, is 4 tracks. And for that matter, anywhere that needs both regional and metro services, sharing the same track just doesn't really work that well. You run into capacity issues, you run into timing issues. Everything just runs a lot smoother if you have 2 tracks dedicated to V-Line, 2 tracks dedicated to Metro, at least for the city part. And really there should be 2 tracks, most if not all of the way to Ballarat, all of the medium distance places. Single distance really only belongs beyond the medium distance places, in my opinion. Okay, so let's see if there's any real comments. Martivy asked me what about Suburban beyond Lilydale towards Healesville and Warburton. I'll discuss that towards the end. That's a good thing to talk about. Northeast Line, Albert, yeah, not beyond Craigieburn. Donnybrook, it's slowly becoming suburbia, yes, but there's not much point extending it just the one stop. Maybe, but not right now. I don't think, not right now. So I think now's the best time to really discuss electrification, particularly in Melbourne, and pretty much only in Melbourne. We have this concept that if it's suburban, it has to be electric. If it's regional, it has to be diesel. That's just a flawed discussion. Well, flawed concept. The reason that's really come about is primarily because, yes, we run on 1,500 volts DC. What the hell does that mean? It means that, well, okay, a bit of electricity discussion here briefly. You've got DC and you've got AC. Direct current, DC. Alternating current, AC. AC, you can very easily adjust the voltage. It's not difficult at all. DC, you can do it. It's more difficult. It's not the easiest thing to do. And so, yeah, effectively, and you need what are called substations every so often along the electric line, because the voltage slowly drops down over the course of the distance, because you lose power, you just do. So you need a substation to boost up that voltage and boost up that power level to the correct amount for that section of track. Now, why did we go with DC and not AC if AC is just better? Well, because when Melbourne's electrification was first being developed, electricity was a pretty new thing. Electricity was not widespread, and there wasn't really any coordination. In fact, the railways ran their own power stations. That's how uncoordinated it all was. And so, yeah, it was kind of an interesting time. And 1500 volts DC, that was a pretty advanced system for the time. It was basically the latest and greatest. Sydney did it as well. The issue is that you have to have, because it's both a low voltage, a relatively low voltage. Yes, your house is 240 volts, so, it's a lot higher than that. But on a railway system, it's fairly low and is DC, so you have to have substations a lot more frequently, and substations are more expensive to boost up the voltage and stuff. Now, when the majority of Melbourne was electrified, a lot of it was effectively the country. And so, yeah, they certainly didn't have the concept back then that, electric is only for suburban services. And I'd even argue to say that it's within the last 40 years that mantra has really developed. But it's not to say that it's impossible to run it beyond suburbia, because we did. We ran electric lines as far as Traralgon. Why did we go to Traralgon and not, say, Geelong? Well, because there was coal in Traralgon. Or specifically throughout Gippsland. It was electrified primarily because of coal. Because it was going to be much cheaper to haul the mass amounts of coal by an electric train than it was by a diesel train. Or steam engines for that matter. And so that's the reason that it was electrified. When that reason disappeared, i.e. the coal was no longer being transported by rail, it just wasn't worth the expense to keep the infrastructure up and running. But Sydney is a slightly different story, because yes, they had a lot of lines electrified because of coal traffic, various freight traffic. But the one thing that they did differently to Victoria, which has very much influenced where they are today and the differences, is that in Victoria, for our regional trains, our regional passenger trains, we used the carriages we already had built, and we just built a separate electric locomotive. And the electric locomotive could haul passenger and freight. Now, Sydney did that as well. They had electric locomotives that hauled both passenger and freight, but they also built electric multiple units. In other words, what you typically think of as an electric train. The locomotives are fairly easy to replace with a diesel, obviously, but a an electric multiple unit, well, it's a full unit, right? So you got to replace effectively what would have been the locomotive and the carriages. And that's the reason why Sydney still has electric regional services, but Victoria doesn't. Albert says, low voltage means high current to develop the same power. So with 1500 volts DC, you also have the expense of thicker copper cables to carry the heavier current. Yes, that's another good point. So now you look at a more modern electrification system. Brisbane was only really electrified in the late 70s, early 80s, and is still being electrified to this day. No, I mean, not really. I mean, am I getting my cities confused? Yeah, I'm thinking of Adelaide. Adelaide is a big mix of electric and diesel suburban services. Not Brisbane. Brisbane has pretty much solely electric suburban services. But what I wanted to talk about with Brisbane specifically was the fact that in Brisbane, the electrification extends beyond Brisbane. Now, Brisbane developed on the much newer standard of 25 kilovolts AC. So, much higher voltage. So, yeah, you can... The higher voltage... The reason that higher voltage means that you have to have less substations, the power lasts a longer distance, is because the formula for power loss in a wire is the wire's resistance times the current squared. So if you double the current, you quadruple the amount of power that's lost. And so, as Albert was saying before, the higher the voltage, the lower the current can be for the same power, because power is current times voltage. That plays in a big role. You can go for a lot further without needing to boost the power. Because you lose less power along the way because you're running a lower current. Think of, if you're confused about voltage and current and the differences between the two, think of it like a water pipe where the voltage is sort of like the pressure in the pipe and the current is sort of like the flow within the pipe. So you can have a lot of water flowing through the pipe but not much pressure, or you can have very high pressure but not much flow. And so, yeah, you see that's the sort of thing that we're talking about with electricity. In the 25 kilovolt system would be the high pressure, low flow, and the 1500 volts DC system would be low pressure, high flow. So, yes. Should Melbourne and Sydney, for that matter, convert to 25 kilovolts AC? Probably not. The expense is very great because you would have to do it pretty much all at once. You can't really just go, oh yeah, this line can be 25 kilovolts, but the other line that can stay 1.5 kilovolts DC. Doesn't work like that, because then you just run into a whole bunch of issues with the compatibility and whatnot, and no. So you have to convert it all at once, And it's not worth it. It's not worth the expense. Electric doesn't have to be the only suburban services. Now, Stony Point is the odd one out in the Metro world because it is run by Metro, but it is a diesel. It is a Sprinter, of course, from V-Line. This light is being a bit funny. That's a bit better. Maybe not. Okay. Yeah, suburban services don't have to be electric. You can definitely have diesel suburban services. And again, I'm not entirely sure how the mantra came about that electric suburban has to be electric. I mean, I understand that pretty much all of suburban is electric and pretty much all of regional is diesel, and so people have sort of become used to the assumption that that's the case, but why we still stick to it, I'm still not entirely sure. But yeah, we certainly managed to run the Stony Point service as a diesel. Heck, Adelaide, I mentioned that before, they still are very much running most of their suburban services as diesel. Perth, I think they're pretty much all electric now, but they're another fairly recent system, so they're on 25 kilovolts AC. Adelaide is, if I didn't mention that already. Tasmania doesn't have any passenger rail services, and neither does Northern Territory. So, well, unless you count the GAN, but that doesn't really count. It's not a suburban train. It's not a commuter train, I should say. Yeah, so I think that it's high time that Metro got their own diesel trains, and they are set up for the sort of distances that they are covering. Whether you want to run them as like I don't know what to call it, almost like a connecting service, I'll call it. That's how they run Stony Point, where you change at Frankston to get the Stony Point services. Yes, I think that could work in certain circumstances. Like Stony Point, I think that works fine. I think for something like Bacchus Marsh, I wouldn't see a need to electrify it, really. But diesel suburban trains, yes. And you could almost argue that that's what V-Line are doing, but I really think it should be dedicated to Metro, because we all know that the lines are going to get blurred between the V-Line short, medium and long. They already do now, but yeah. It's worth a mention, the V-Line H-set carriages. H-sets, of course, were famously Harris Suburban electric trains that were full of asbestos and were converted to V-Line carriages. And I always find it funny how there are some, we'll call them stuck-up regional commuters who complain about, oh, my train is so outdated, it's from the 80s. They don't know. They're riding a Harris train. It's from the 50s. So I always find it funny that they're complaining about it and it's 3 decades older than they really think. So H-sets are very much used for those V-Line short distance trips, or at least they're supposed to be, but you still find them trekking out to Shepparton and stuff every once in a while, Warrnambool. As I said, V-Line gets confused. You discourage commuters from catching the train when you mix up the carriage design. If you run a short distance carriages on a long distance route, or vice versa. So I think that with Bacchus Marsh, if you're going to provide suburban services, which I think that they should, it should be a through route to Melbourne. I think that there's room to run semi-express as far as Sunshine, but yeah, definitely for the most part, just run them as far as just make sure you run them through, because Sunshine just isn't far enough out, I think, to change trains. People would get annoyed, and you are then discouraging people from using public transport, and that's your ultimate goal. What is the time? It's 10:07, so we'll keep going for a little while longer. Melbourne PDA says, Stony Point run stupidly. They can store a train at Frankston but won't. They can use the diesel pump at Frankston but won't. It's too stupid. Yeah, you can get into the politics there. When you are on a Suburban arriving at Frankston, it should say now arriving at Frankston. Change here for Stony Point services. This train will terminate at Frankston, however, it doesn't, and it should. It doesn't, but there are announcements that say that Stony Point, on stations, they say Stony Point commuters should board this train because they have a guaranteed connection. RTV says he wants the Met to return. Meh. Exact brands don't matter. Tates are from the 1880s. No, not quite. Swing doors were. Tates were from I think the first Tate entered service 1912, which was slightly before electrification. But Tates were purpose-built for electrification. Stuff around with the shortest distance velocities, too much, running them further than what short distance. Yes, that's what I'm saying, is that they will run them. They will run the short distance ones where the long distance should run, and run the long distance where the short distance should run. Alright, so I think that the final piece of this puzzle is talking about outer suburban branch lines. Specifically, Stony Point is the only real one of those lines that is left, but formerly, excuse my voice, you had the Whittlesea line, you had the Healesville line, Warburton, Gembrook, Mornington, Red Hill, although that's a bit different. I think that Mornington deserves a service, but really the ideal would be to build a brand new track direct to Frankston, not via Baxter. But via Baxter is better than nothing. I think it would be good also if the Mornington service reached down a little further onto the peninsula and maybe went as far as Dramana, say. Dramana is where you hit the big mountain. I've travelled on the bus down that way a couple of times. It's a decent service, but gets a bit full. Yeah. Or alternatively, I would be okay with a connecting light rail service. We can talk about light rail another time. Stony Point can say it is Red Hill. It's not much point putting Red Hill back into service. Hillsville and Warburton. Oh. It's popular to say that they should never have cut the trains to Hillsville and Warburton. But honestly, when you looked at the traffic numbers when they did close the lines, they were pretty damn low. I don't blame them at all. I don't think that Hillsville deserves a train line now, because you've got Yarra Glen and then Hillsville. Yeah, just leave it to the tourist railway, honestly, and they're better served by buses, those towns. Warburton, now you've got a few towns along the way to Warburton. You've got like Mount Evelyn, Seville, Warrayallock, Launching Place, Yarra Junction, and then Warburton. I would say no, short answer. To provide a decent service, you would have to have a track that was straighter, and because the Warburton line is very wiggly, and so yeah, it's just like, if you're going to provide it, you got to provide it as a relatively straight track, and by the time you straighten out the track, that's a big expenditure. Not worth it. If trains were still running to Warburton already, and the tracks were still there and everything, I'd say, yeah, go for it. But, yeah, it's not worth it. Instagram's telling me that my stream is going to be ending in about 2 minutes, so I guess I'll quickly wrap it up. Gembrook, leave that as Puffing Belly, that's fine. We'll see. Extend Suburban services out as needed. I really think that they should have gone as far as Yan Yan when they extended out to Mernda, but oh well. And of course run suburban trains as far as what I've already said, Bacchus Marsh, Wyndham Vale, etc. Yeah, out of suburban branch lines, and South Gippsland, maybe. It's not. You need to again straighten out the track, and then it's probably not worth it. Just extend suburban services as required. Coldstream is close enough to be called Suburbia. Yeah, maybe. I've got 30 seconds remaining. Should have electrified the line to Coldstream instead of closing it. Maybe. I don't really think so. There's just not enough people out there, basically. Oh, come on. Alright, everyone, I got cut off there, but thanks for watching the stream. Sorry for the YouTube dramas, out of my control. Coldstream, yeah, not worth electrifying. There's just not enough people there. Leave it to the tourist railway. Yeah, I think I've mentioned everything I wanted to mention, so thanks again. Video out hopefully this Sunday, and another live stream in 2 weeks' time. See ya. Actually, I wanted to mention one last thing in terms of suburban railways. The inner and outer circle lines, just briefly. Inner circle line, not worth restoring. It's pretty well served by trams. Outer circle, quite possibly worth putting back in, because it travels through some fairly dense suburban areas, and most of the track formation is still there. The other little suburban lines like Kew, not worth it. St Kilda Windsor, definitely not worth it. Port Melbourne and St Kilda, discuss that another time. Rosstown Railway, definitely no. Springvale Cemetery, no. Yeah, that's pretty much all of the famous ones, I guess, described. Upfield Somerton, not as a suburban train. Maybe as a regional line, but not as a suburban train. Not worth it. So, yep. Suburban regular services to Flemington Racecourse. Quite possibly, but that area is well served by trams, so probably not. But I don't know. Could be used. Anyway, that's it from me. Thanks again. See ya.